Hey guys, it's Toniko Pantoja, and today I want to talk about storyboard advice that were given by professionals that I don't necessarily find helpful to beginning storyboard artists or aspiring storyboard artists. So for this video, I do want to talk about some storyboarding advice I have received when I was a new storyboard artist in the industry. It actually hurt me as a storyboard artist and someone who just likes to express with the medium of animation and storyboarding. Now, the thing about some of these advice I have received is that most of them have good intentions. You know, some of it is tough love. Some give the impression that storyboarding work should not be underestimated, which I do agree with. However, a lot of it can be misleading. So the conversation I'm going to have is quite nuanced, bringing up all these certain advice that I've received in the past, and just talk about the intentions behind them, what it could be perceived as good, and how it could be problematic, and can hurt the storyboarding community. And then I'm going to try and do my best to make that advice more friendly, more useful, and more productive. So with that being said, let's talk about that. The first one I want to talk about is you don't need solid draftsmanship for your storyboards. So I kind of do agree with the intentions of this because people can sometimes get wrapped up in trying to make the drawing look good, appealing, and solid. And because they're worrying too much about that, they don't get a storyboard sequence done. Versus getting an overall pass done, like a really rough first pass. If you just want to storyboard just for the sake of storyboarding and just having a reference, then you can draw the way you want. But the thing about storyboarding and drawing is that you want to have clear drawings that speak for itself. And that does require a level of draftsmanship that allows you to do that. Like if you wanted to push the mood and emotion in a storyboard, you might want to have good observational skills so you can push the acting that feels very believable. If you want to have more control of your shots in terms of the composition, the depth, and sort of the angles, it's good to know perspective. And when professionals gave this advice, and some of these professionals are from Pixar, from DreamWorks, these are people who had experience as storyboard artists for many years, giving this advice that can be misleading because, you know, I've seen it happen. It's happened with me in the past where the priority of improving my drawing skills was pushed aside, whereas I just focused on storyboarding, but I do think that having decent drawing skills at the time would have made me perform much better as a storyboard artist in certain productions. And the issue that I have with some of these professionals is that they've had many years of experience finessing their drawing skills and their storyboarding work. And to tell aspiring storyboard artists that they don't need good draftsmanship skills is misleading because I do think good draftsmanship skills elevates the storyboard. The thing about storyboarding is that you don't need to draw super detailed. It's ideal to draw quick, loose, gestural that is somewhat clear, but that still requires a decent amount of drawing experience because a lot of it can be muscle memory. Now, if I were to give a similar advice that sounds a lot more productive, I would say for a first pass of storyboarding, just be as rough and loose. So you have something that exists as a storyboard, and then you can go back and finesse the drawings, fix the perspective, push the poses, clean it up a bit, but still keeping it rather simple. Because I think the intention of this advice is just to get something that exists and something that is done as a first pass. And then for another pass, you change things up, you fix some stuff, but at least you have something that you can work off of. The next one I want to talk about is some storyboard artists say that thumbnailing and planning is a waste of time, just start making the boards. So it's similar to the intention of the earlier advice I talked about. Just do storyboards for the sake of storyboarding. Don't think too hard about the sequence, just get a version done. But I think if you're inexperienced and you're still trying to figure out the art of storyboarding, as well as let's say dealing with ADHD, it's going to be a very chaotic process because what sometimes happens is, you know, when you're bored, you kind of get indecisive or you're boarding something and you realize the sequence is not turning out the way you intended. Storyboard artists with years of experience have a familiar sense of being able to board straight ahead, being able to edit things in their mind, and being able to just draw out exactly how they're feeling. All of those years of experience help them build a mental library that they could constantly reuse for future boarding work. If you're a newer and aspiring storyboard artist, I would highly recommend that you guys plan. So a form of planning for storyboards is, let's say you write a shot list before you even start drawing, or you draw really small drawings that represent the shot and panels that you want without expending too much energy with official storyboard panels. And the reason why I think thumbnailing and planning is still really good is it helps you figure out or feel out what your sequence is about, what it's not about, and being able to make mistakes without sacrificing too much. It might be more work to have the stage of planning, whether it's writing a shot list, whether it's thumbnailing. However, I think it's going to help you save a lot of creative headaches when actually making your storyboards. So don't underestimate the planning stage. An example of that just being thumbnails. Now, the next one I want to talk about is when a storyboard artist says you need to board an X amount a day. So an example that I'm going to throw out is you need to board 100 panels a day of storyboarding, or usually that number is quite high because I think they also want to emphasize that storyboarding work, there's just a lot of drawing, a lot of panels to get done, and a lot of that work does get tossed out because storyboarding and pre-production is a very liquid stage of the animation production. I think the intention about that is that there's just a lot of work when it comes to storyboarding, and you can't just underestimate that. Now, there's a bunch of stuff that I do have to say about this advice. Number one is that not all sequences are the same. Some are more simple, some are more complex, some have a lot more movement and information, and some are more limited. Some sequences are long and some are short. It's hard to determine a number for that stuff. Very similar when an animator says you have to animate an X amount of feet or seconds or frames a day, but some of those shots might have very little to no movement, and some will have like 6 characters on screen doing something really dynamic together. So you really can't predict that number. I think the issue that I have with this advice too is that a lot of people who are new to the industry will take this advice and say, oh, I need to like over animate my boards to reach this number of panels instead of making a good storyboard piece. So I personally would change this advice completely, where I would say try to nail the big chunks of the storyboard sequence and work as simple and smart as possible. So examples of working smart in storyboarding is, let's say, just start with simple shots. Nothing too complicated, but something that is easy to read and something that is easy to track while editing. Another idea is just to have one drawing per shot instead of trying to have so many different poses for one shot. At least you have the foundation of your whole sequence. And then once you have that, then you can start chiseling down those big chunks, like add more poses for the acting, maybe add more in between to the action if needed, and maybe revise shots or push shots that might need it. And the reason why I think it's good to have big chunks at first is so that you have something that can be presented, something that can be shown, and you can see things in the bigger picture. If you're working in a production, they can see a version of it and add their own input before you commit to putting more work to something that might be thrown away. So when it comes to storyboarding, try to think of it as simple, big chunks from beginning to end, instead of thinking in a way of how many panels should I get done per day. And it's just going to make you focus more on the overall sequence. Okay, the next one is going to be a bit more personal. So when I was new, I was working under someone who made it his life to wear his career on his sleeve, and he would do a lot of overtime. Unpaid overtime, because he truly believed that you had to prove yourself to be a reliable board artist. I worked under this individual, and this individual would say things like, if your storyboards do not make it to the final animatic, then he considers that a failure. So I would do my best to turn in really overworked boards, only for him to redraw it in his own style and just revise it himself without letting us know. And I felt awful because I felt like I failed. Many years later, I've worked on many different productions and experiences. And the thing that you're going to learn about storyboarding is that a lot of changes happen. And if your boards and panels do not make it to the final animatic, your boards might have just helped them realize that it's not the direction that they're going after. And sometimes the storyboards reveal a problem that isn't the storyboard artist's fault. It could be that the writing doesn't work visually, so they had to change it. It could be poor communication skills overall. And in some productions, storyboard artists are pushed into a different assignment, so they'll have to have someone else do the corrections over some work that you did. I think what I'm trying to say is that storyboarding is a very collaborative part, and to say things like a storyboard not making it into the final animatic being a failure is so petty. And now that I think about it, it's more of an ego thing. Think about it, animatics are not the final product. It's the animation after the animatic in storyboards. I guess it's just there to have proof that your storyboards were the heavy reference that they used for the final product. Bragging rights, basically. And not everyone's gonna have access to those storyboards or the means to view them. I don't think it's a bad idea to sort of check in and say, hey, I want to be a reliable board artist, so are there ways that I can improve my storyboards so my storyboards are reliable? It doesn't help to ask that, and maybe they can give you some input for future work. I would be careful with someone who promotes hustle culture, who talks about how hard storyboarding is and they work super hard to get to where they're at. At the same time, I will also be careful of someone who says, if your storyboards don't make it to the final animatic, it's a failure, because their career is their ego. Now, the last one I'm going to talk about is something that I've talked about in previous videos in the past, and it's when it's enforced to overly animate and overpose your storyboards. My stance is that if you enjoy doing that stuff, you should have the freedom to do that. It shouldn't be enforced. Now, I do think when it comes to action scenes or scenes where there's a lot more movement, you might need more drawings to make that clear. However, if you're thinking about stuff like slow ins and slow outs, spacing, arcs and ups and downs, full in-betweens, that's basically animation. And that's a completely different skill set too, because if you're not familiar with that stuff, your boards will come off as distracting because it would just really stick out. Another thing that I would say is that you're wearing multiple hats already, and if you add a big one like animation, you're just gonna get burned out faster. I feel like the over-animating storyboards came because we have more tools that allows us to board fast, and sometimes those tools allow storyboard artists to basically edit their own sequences. That, and we're seeing supervisors and higher ups that don't really know how to read a storyboard anymore, to the point where they demand a storyboard look as close as possible to a finished animated project. And the job of storyboarding is becoming much more than just storyboards. It's become multiple positions under one salary of a storyboard artist. So it really sucks to see other professional storyboard artists say, hey, if you can't do these highly animated storyboards, you don't have what it takes to work for the industry. Like, sometimes I get the sense that professionals like to talk about how hard their work is, when in honesty, you should prioritize working smarter and economic first. So those were some of the advice that I got over time that I felt like could be misunderstood and sometimes not really be helpful for someone who wants to get into storyboarding and eventually work as a storyboard artist. Just to sort of rephrase what I talked about or what I sort of preach, I would say don't be afraid to just be really loose and really rough with your first pass of boards, and then revisit and revise those storyboards so they're a bit cleaner to read. It's good to get big chunks of your storyboards rather than think about how many panels you should be boarding. If you're storyboarding for a production, it's a very collaborative project, so if your boards don't make it to the final animatic, in most cases the number one culprit is just poor communication. But sometimes directions change. Sometimes storyboarding work can be demanding. Sometimes it asks you to do stuff like overposing or animating. I wish a lot more professionals encourage simplicity first. Like I said earlier, I do sort of understand the intentions of all these advice I've just talked about. I just thought that it would be good to revisit these advice I've gotten as a new board artist, and sometimes I see these advice be passed on to newer students or to newer board artists that I find not productive at all. And if I were to reapproach that advice so it actually is a lot more productive. Anyways, that's all. Bye. Interested in learning hand-drawn animation or learning how to finish an animated shot from beginning to end? Have a look at the store where you'll find the complete Introduction to 2D Animation video course, tutorials, and other resources. Learn classical animation approaches, drawing, lectures, techniques, and other process videos. Visit the store through the link in the description below.